Hello, my name is William I. Robinson. I'm a professor of sociology at the University of California at Santa Barbara. As all of you know, all on genocide is taking place against Palestine. I'd like to talk today about that genocide, specifically in the context of global capitalism and its crisis. So we cannot let horror become normalized, and we're not going to. I'm going to talk with you about this genocide in a context maybe you haven't heard about. And I think really we're at a historic turning point. There is this global intifada of solidarity underway with Palestine, something that we've never seen before. This is unprecedented, and I want to suggest it is also, this intifada in solidarity with Palestine is also a catalyst for something much bigger. It has touched a raw nerve among humanity. It's telling us we've reached the end point. This can happen now anywhere. The defense of humanity is now the defense of Palestine. So I want to take us back a little bit, though, and say that genocidal pressures are built into the Zionist project. We would have come to this point of all-out genocide sooner or later, at some point, absent one of two things that had to have happened. One, that Zionism was defeated, or secondly, that the United States withdrew its unconditional support for Israel. Those two haven't happened at this time. And specifically, why genocide? Why now? Well, that's been triggered by the crisis of global capitalism itself. And that's something I'm going to talk with you now. But first, I want to say, in my view, part of our struggle in defense of Palestinian lives, in defense of Palestinian freedom, is that we need to step up a head-on confrontation with Israel's legitimating myths and discourses. We cannot let the Zionists establish the narrative. They have gotten away with doing so for decades and decades, right up to the beginning of and in the midst of this genocide. We all know what anti-Semitism is. It's discrimination against or hatred of Jews. That has absolutely anti-Zionism, and condemnation of the Israeli colonial apartheid project has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Many of you will be familiar with this term, Hasbada. Hasbada is a Hebrew term that roughly means public perception, right? And that's just a polite way of saying propaganda. So the Zionist Hasbada is, in my view, really perhaps the most powerful propaganda machinery on the planet. May even surpass that of the United States. It bombards the global public, and especially us here in the United States, with what we call PSYOPs, psychological operations and political operations, 24/7 for decades and decades now. So we speak about the Israel lobby. Absolutely, it's the most powerful lobby in the United States, but it's really a misnomer to say that this is a lobby because it's something much bigger. We typically talk about a lobby, for instance, like the pharmaceutical corporation will send lobbyists to Washington to meet with Congress members and try and get a drug approved, or they'll go to the FDA. Something along those lines, or the gun lobby will lobby so that there's no gun control laws. But this is something much, much bigger and different. The Israel lobby is fused into the very political system of the United States, into civil society, into the corporate structure. Throughout the entire country, it operates on every single level. And its objective here has always been to have journalists, politicians, academics, and even activists, even Palestine solidarity activists, self-center out of fear and out of intimidation. And that, of course, is the role of this current wave of repression and criminalization of Palestine solidarity. To have people say, I'm not even going to open my mouth. I'm scared to really use the word genocide. I'm really scared to call this out. I'm scared to point that Zionism is very similar and has origins, I'm going to get into this, has same origins as Nazism. We're scared to say any of that and have this chilling atmosphere. And so this is the purpose. This is the way that the Israel lobby works. The IDF, that's the Israeli Defense Force, and the Israeli Foreign Ministry, they have Hasbada branches, actually organized Hasbada branches to carry out these psychological operations and political operations all over the world. And they have set up numerous front organizations in the United States. The most well-known is the AIPAC, American Israeli Political Affairs Committee. You probably know that that committee is spending $100 million in this electoral cycle to get politicians who are critiquing Israel not elected, and to elect those that will continue this unconditional, steadfast U.S. backing for this Israeli genocidal project. I just learned that Jamal Bowman, a recently elected congressperson, extremely outspoken, coming out against this genocide, AIPAC is spending $20 million on this one congressman to get him out of office. But then we have the Anti-Defamation League. They went after me. I'm not academically, I'm not historically a specialist in Palestine. I study global Latin America, and I study global capitalism and its crisis. In 2009, Israel carried out Operation Cast Lead, which was an attack on Gaza. It left 1,400 Palestinians dead, several thousands more injured. It was this giant massacre, and I denounced that on my campus, University of California at Santa Barbara, and this lobby came after me big time. It was a 6-month campaign to try to get me fired from the university. It was led by the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which is the second really most powerful organization after AIPAC in the lobby. Abraham Foxman was at that time the president of the ADL. He made a special trip in from Washington to our campus to meet with our chancellor and with the deans and with pro-Zionist faculty. He opened up the meeting by saying, I've flown in here for one reason, to tell you you need to get rid of Robinson. So this is the lobby in action. And they have all of these front organizations that are strictly just for campuses, such as Canary Mission, David Project, and AMCHA. So no, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, and as we're going to see, Zionism is a project of the far right that defends Israel, and referring to the far right in the United States and in Western Europe and elsewhere, an extreme far right. The same far right forces that are leading us towards fascism are the same far right forces which defends Israel and defends Zionism. In fact, remarkably, anti-Semites are Zionists and are fascists. Defense of Palestine is our defense against this push towards a fascist takeover. It is so unbelievable. If we go back and remember the Unite the Right rally, which took place in North Carolina in 2017, some of those far-right figures were carrying Southern Confederacy flags, or even Ku Klux Klan and even Nazi flags, and others were carrying the Israeli flag. This is like unbelievable. So no, there are not two warring sides. This is not a war, it's a genocide. It's not an Israel-Palestine conflict, any more than we would have said that Africans struggling against apartheid during the apartheid period in South Africa, we wouldn't have said that this is a white African conflict. We wouldn't have said during World War II this is a Nazi-Jewish conflict. Okay, so this is not an Israel-Palestine conflict, it's an Israeli genocide of the Palestinians. And no, Israel does not have a right to, quote, defend itself. The reason we're going to emphasize this, it is so important, is that this is maybe the most significant slogan of Israel and its defenders in its propaganda machinery. We have a right to defend ourselves. Israel has a right to defend itself. We hear it over and over, and even us Palestine solidarity activists forget that we have to challenge that for several reasons. The first thing is, we would not have said that the apartheid regime in South Africa had a right to defend itself from African resistance. We wouldn't have said that the German state had a right to defend itself, that that were resisting it. So Israel does not have a right to defend itself, because the right to when Israel says it has the right to defend itself, it's saying it has a right to defend apartheid and colonialism and dispossession and genocide. But that's not even the most important point. The most important point when we hear that Israel has a right to defend itself is that in international law, one state has a right to defend itself from external aggression by another state. But Palestinians are not another state outside of their homeland. Palestinians are resisting from within their own homeland. So international law, which gives states the right to defend themselves from external aggression, doesn't even apply here. And we need to emphasize that, again, not let this Zionist Hezbollah machinery control the narrative. No, Jews are not a people and do not trace their ancestry to Palestine, and I'm going to get into that in just a minute. And no, of course, Israel is not a democracy. It's an illegal apartheid state, literally an outlaw state. literally has flagrantly violated any and every international law and has simply ignored any and every resolution coming out of the United Nations. And now, of course, it's just simply ignored the International Court of Justice's initial ruling that there's a preliminary, evidence that a genocide is underway, and then his two most recent rulings calling for it to not go into Rafah and to stop these massacres. So Israel is an international outlaw state. So as our movement in solidarity with Palestine builds, and again, this is simply unprecedented, we are at a turning point here. But as it builds up, we are now speaking the language of, quote, Israel is weaponizing anti-Semitism. And that's absolutely true, and that's good that we're now using that language. But here I want to deepen the critique of Zionism. And the comparison between the Nazis and fascism and genocide, the comparison of those three things, right? Nazism, fascism, genocide, with Zionism and Israeli genocide. That comparison has been turned into a taboo by Zionist propaganda and intimidation machinery. Yet it's historically, empirically, and analytically accurate. When I denounced the Israeli siege on Gaza in 2009, and when this became an issue that I now research, write about, and speak about, and politically get engaged with. So this is what I wrote in 2009, which so riled up the Zionists. Zionists and defenders of the Israeli state take great offense at any analogy between the Nazis and Israeli state actions, including the charge of genocide, in part because the Jewish Holocaust is used by the Israeli state and the Zionist political project as a mechanism of colonial legitimation, so that to draw such analogies is to undermine Israel's legitimating discourse. It is crucial to point this out because that discourse now legitimates Israeli genocide. So I wrote that in 2009 when I characterized this siege of Gaza as slow motion genocide. Now, of course, we are an all-out open genocide. What I'm going to go into now might be very eye-opening for some of you listening to this. But I want to say it's so important to break this taboo at a time when anti-Zionism is being criminalized by the U.S. government. You may know that the Congress already passed this Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, and I would be very surprised if Biden did not sign it into law at some time in the next few weeks or a few months, and that will be used to criminalize us if we dare to say that, if we dare to say anything which is against the state of Israel. It'll be called anti-Semitic, and then it will be a criminal offense. I'll get into that in just a moment. But I want to say that Zionism is a proto-fascist ideology, and it is a close cousin of Nazism. Zionists have been allies of anti-Semites historically and today. While this may shock you, we're going to see the actual historical evidence right now. Israel has made the definition of anti-Semitism an international political background. I defined earlier anti-Semitism as discriminated against or prejudice and hatred of Jews. That was historically the long-standing understanding of what anti-Semitism is. It has existed. It still exists. We combat it tooth and nail. Anyone who wants to call themselves human. And that has nothing to do with anti-Zionism. So Israel's project, with the assistance of the United States, of course, was to have this worldwide political battle to change the definition of anti-Semitism. In 2001, the Swedish Prime Minister formed the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and that was originally, I believe, had fairly good intentions to just remembrance of the Holocaust, almost immediately infiltrated by Israel, and this battle got underway in international politics to redefine anti-Semitism as criticism of the state of Israel as anti-Zionism. In 2010, the U.S. government adopts that definition. It adopts this new definition. By 2016, 31 states officially embraced that definition. You will see on the slide here that there's one image of the Warsaw Ghetto. In 2009, I said Gaza is Israel's Warsaw. So that's the Warsaw Ghetto. You'll see the wall that was put up so Jews could not leave and would starve to death in that concentration camp. And then you see the apartheid wall. That's running right through Bethlehem in Palestinian territory. By the way, the International Court of Justice ruling in January that it's plausible the genocide's taking place, and its subsequent rulings to ordering Israel to stop its bombardments and so forth. That wasn't the first ICJ rulings. The first ICJ ruling was that this apartheid wall is a violation of international law and has to be taken down. Of course, it's been ignored. And the second ICJ ruling is that the Jewish settlements in the West Bank are illegal and have to be dismantled. So if you look at this map here, and we know this, that Palestine has been this historic crossroads of empires for thousands of years. Come under the sway of the Egyptian Empire, the Roman, the Greek empires, the Persian empires, the Assyrian empires. I mean, for thousands of years, because Palestine is located in the crossroads of east, west, and north, south of the whole old world, it's always been under the wing of one or another empire. But then the British, and so the last one was the Ottoman Empire, and that broke up. It starts to break up in 1916 because the Ottomans participated in the side that lost World War I, and this begins the British colonization of Palestine, which takes place, consummates from 1916 to 1920. This is a different type of empire. It's a different type of colonization because now it is capitalism. The system which is now colonizing and conquering Palestine is capitalism, world capitalism being fully brought into and colonizing Palestine. And in fact, British colonization takes place in the context of the heyday of a new round of European colonial expansion. Lenin wrote his famous pamphlet, Imperialism, the latest stage of capitalism. He published that in 1917, and he's analyzing this new wave of outward colonial and imperialist expansion, which colonizes all of Africa, all of what remains of Asia that hadn't been colonized, so forth. And the Middle East now is going to be absolutely key because the Ottoman Empire is breaking up, and incoming are going to be European colonizing projects, but now as part of world capitalism. And so you're going to have an alliance of Zionism with imperialism, and this is going to lead to the creation of Israel. The Zionists are going to say to the European colonizers and imperialists, please back our project and we will support and defend your colonialism and your imperialism. And so Israel is founded as a Middle Eastern outpost for post-World War II global capitalism. This establishment of Israel as this Middle Eastern outpost of post-World War II global capitalism is going to take place, and it's going to be expanded at a very strategic moment because the Arab masses now are in full-out struggle. Arab nationalism is on the rise. Arab socialism is on the rise. And so the project of colonizing Palestine, there's two strategies of Western colonialism and imperialism. One is to create Israel as this Middle Eastern outpost for world capitalist interests, and the other is to put in place reactionary elite Arab regimes, such as the Saudi family, such as the Jordan monarchy, such as the dictatorship in Egypt, to hold down the Arab masses and to defend world capitalism in the Middle East. So before I get to the very centerpiece of my discussion with you, my presentation, is global capitalism and its crisis, and how that helps us understand exactly what's going on with this genocide. But before I get to that, I want to interrogate a little further Zionism itself. What is Zionism? And in fact, Zionism originates as a far-right, racist, proto-fascist political ideology among a small minority of Eastern European Jews in the late 1800s. It's not a hegemonic ideology. The vast majority of Jews in Europe, in East and West Europe, are not interested in Zionism. They're not following Zionism at all. It doesn't become a hegemonic ideology among Jews until the 1930s. And of course, what happens to make it hegemonic is the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust. So Zionism originates in the late 19th century in what we call racial nationalism. This racial nationalism swept Europe and North America at this time in the late 1800s. Racial nationalism argued that every person on the planet, every human being, belongs to a biologically determined and fixed race. A biological race. And every biological race on the planet needs its own homeland, its own territory, its own land, its own country. And this is where the phrase that you may have heard, blood and soil. right? Which is very closely associated with fascism and far right, and Nazism. That's where blood and soil originates from, this racial nationalism. So Zionism is racial nationalism. It's the same racial nationalism that gave us Zionism is the racial nationalism that gave us Nazism. It's the racial nationalism which in the United States gave us Manifest Destiny, the pure Anglo-Saxon race, which is destined to have this land. And so all of this is the idea of ethnically uniform states. So in 1897, in Vienna, the first Zionist Congress is held. 1 year earlier, the father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl, publishes his book, which is the Bible of the Zionist project, titled The Jewish State. And that book called for a Jewish state somewhere in the world. Herzl says, well, it could be Argentina. Let's look into that, getting some land there and making a Jewish state. Then he says, well, it could be Uganda. Uganda would be perfect. Let's get that. And then he says, well, it also could be Palestine. And other Zionists eventually insist that we really need to keep it focused on Palestine because we can then legitimate colonizing Palestine for Zionism based on the Old Testament. So Zionist ideology says that the history of Palestine was suspended with the Roman conquest of the Jewish kingdom in 70 AD. And this is what we call a foundational myth, the allegory of Jewish dispersal and exile, and it's what we call implanted memory. So I said earlier, Jews are not a people because Judaism is a religion any more than Christians are a people, than Buddhists are a people. We wouldn't say the Muslim people, the atheist people, the Buddhist people, and so forth. What we are talking about here as Judaism is a faith community. Jews did not have a common history or a common language, nor a territory they had inhabited for centuries. These are myths. There were Jewish communities in what today is Yemen, in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula. There were Jewish communities in what is today Morocco, what is today Algeria. The Berbers in the desert had their own Jewish communities in what's today the Algerian desert. There are Jewish Persian communities. And especially with the first 300 years AD of the Roman Empire, Judaism spreads all around this region through conversion, just like how Christianity spread, just as Islam spread, and it brings together diverse peoples, diverse cultures. The only thing that a Moroccan Jew and a Persian Jew and a Yemen, what today we would say Yemenese Jew, and a Jew in Eastern Europe shared was their religious faith. The same way that if I'm Christian, I share that religious faith with a Christian person from China or from Mongolia, and a Christian person from Brazil, and a Christian person from the Congo, and a Christian person from Denmark. We all share a faith community. We don't share similar, the same history, the same cultures, the same origins at all. But the Zionists then have to create this myth of a single Jewish biologically determined people in order to legitimate the conquest of Palestine. So in the late 1800s, the Zionists invent this historic myth of the Jewish people and a Jewish homeland to justify this colonial project. Now, this is the exact same legitimations that the Nazis are using, that there is a pure Aryan nation, and that pure Aryan nation belongs on German soil and only for Germany. And it goes all the way back to Teutonic tribes, going back thousands of years BC. So this is the same. These are the parallels here. But you have to have this myth of a Jewish people that was kicked out of their homeland and now have to go back, because that's the only way you're going to legitimate colonization, claim a state in Palestine, to say that Jews are now returning to their original homeland and resuming history. Zionist ideology considers the Jewish nation to be a biological entity that gives substance to its national demands. So this is really classical scientific racism. I know that many of you will know something about or have studied the history of racism in the modern era, the era of the capitalist world system, and know that scientific racism emerges in the mid-1800s, and it tries to establish a biological base for different races and their relationships among them. If the political father of Zionism is Theodor Herzl, the intellectual father, or at least one of the key intellectual fathers of Zionism, was Zev Jabotinsky. He writes in 1936, and now I'm quoting him directly, "Jews have a distinctive blood that sets them apart from other people. It is quite clear that the source of the national sentiment cannot be found in education, but in something that precedes it. In what? In the blood. The sense of national identity is inherent in man's blood, in his physical racial type, and only in that. It is physically impossible for a Jew descended from several generations of pure, unmixed Jewish blood to adopt the mental state of a German or a Frenchman, just as it is impossible for a Negro to cease to be a Negro. And I continue with the actual quote. The essence of a nation is its special physical attribute, the formula of its racial composition. In the final analysis, when all shells arising from history, the climate, natural surroundings, and outside influences have been removed, the nation is reduced to its racial kernel. So that's the actual quote from this 1936 book written by Jabotinsky. And again, classical scientific racism. And you might say, well, that's now outdated. But in fact, as we speak, in the 2000s, in this century, there are Jewish so-called scientists in Israel which are claiming that there is a Jewish gene. Now, I don't have to tell you that the Nazi scientists did the best they could to try and identify a biological basis for a pure Aryan race, etc., etc. And then I don't have to tell you that eugenetics and the whole scientific racism movement in the United States did the same thing, measuring people's cranium and their physical attributes, etc., etc., try and determine this. So this is a classical position of scientific racism, and as we speak today, Zionists are saying there is a Jewish gene, so this is not just history. By definition, Zionism is apartheid. You may not know that Israel not only backed apartheid South Africa, but armed it and supplied it with the technology and the training to develop nuclear weapons. When the African National Congress came to power, it dismantled the nuclear weapons program. And it's not just that. The Zionists back, arm, and train military dictatorships and repressive regimes all over the world, especially in Latin America. It's a long history. There was a genocide against the Mayan Indians in Guatemala in the 1980s. Between 200,000 to 300,000 Mayan indigenous were genocided in that decade. The Guatemalan army was armed and trained and advised in the field in that genocide by Israel. Israel immediately recognized and backed the Pinochet dictatorship when the democratically elected social government of Salvador Allende was overthrown in 1973. The Zionists armed and backed the military dictatorships in Argentina and Uruguay. It's armed and backed and trained in the field the brutal genocidal Colombian military. Only recently now we have the first leftist president in Colombia that broke diplomatic relations with Israel. Is that relationship being questioned? Later we'll see one of the reasons Israel is doing all of this, but the point is that Israel has always been Zionism, always a far-right neo-fascist project. So in 1976, because here's the irony, this history speaks for itself and it undermines the Zionist narrative. 1976, Israel invites for an official state visit to Israel the South African Prime Minister, John Vorster. Now, John Vorster, who was he? He was a Nazi sympathizer and organizer. From within South Africa, he was the commander of the fascist Assenwabwetwag organization, which sided with Hitler in World War II. Yes, you heard it right. This Nazi, proclaimed Nazi organizer in South Africa, becomes Prime Minister of South Africa, invited to Israel in 1976 on an official state business visit. So here's the words. You see on your screen there, you can see what Vorster said when he arrives in South Africa. He said, when he's in South Africa, he says, the Jews took Israel from the Arabs after the Arabs had lived there for 1,000 years. In that, I agree with them. Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state. So the larger context here is the relationship between Zionism, capitalist colonialism, and imperialism. The Zionist position here is that it was futile to fight anti-Semitism in Europe. Herzl wrote in his book, quote, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I began to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognized the emptiness and futility of trying to combat anti-Semitism. That's an exact quote by the father of Zionism. After Hitler comes to power, the German Zionist organizations write a memo to Hitler expressing Zionism's, and now there comes the direct quote, Zionism's hope for collaboration on the assumption that its aims, that is, Nazi aims and Zionist aims, separation of Jews from Christians, from Germans. So go back to the quote. Zionism writes this memo saying its hope for collaboration with the Nazis on the assumption that its aims were similar to theirs. Also, it's at this time that Zionists violently attack anti-Zionist Jews. This is the way that Zionism becomes the hegemonic ideology within Jewish communities. You know, Israel is established in 1948, and Israel invites Albert Einstein, who had left fleeing Nazi persecution, left to the United States. He's in Princeton, New Jersey, and he's invited in 1948 by the Zionists to become the first president of Israel. And he says, no, thank you. You guys are fascists. I don't want anything to do with this. And he points out, and other Jews at that time point out, that any Jews that were not Zionist and combated Zionism were just as violently persecuted, even shot dead in Palestine. This violent persecution of anti-Zionist Jews to establish this hegemony of Zionism. So we have the rise of Nazism and World War II. And Jews now are fleeing Germany. They're trying to get into the United Kingdom. They're trying to get into the United States. And both Britain and the U.S. turn them away. And one reason they turn them away is because Britain and the U.S. are anti-Semitic governments. But the Zionists agreed with this. They said, that's great. Please don't take Jewish refugees, UK. Please, United States, don't take Jewish refugees. Because the Zionist project was these Jewish refugees would have only one place they could flee to, and that was Palestine. And so it's now in the 1930s where you get this massive increase of Jewish immigration into Palestine. And now we see the first major large-scale Jewish-Palestinian tensions. And the reason we see those tensions is because now the Jews coming into Palestine and attempting to seize the land are doing so through the project of Zionism, whose slogan was a land without a people for a people without a land. So I want to add here that this is also another universal mythology of conquest, that the conquerors are finding an empty land just waiting to be civilized. When the Dutch colonizers arrived in South Africa, a country dense with Africans, they declared this is empty land, here for the taking. When the British arrived in Australia, they said the same thing, although it was densely occupied. When the Anglo-Saxons arrived here in North America, there were 20 million indigenous living here in North America. That figure from the 1500s is reduced to 300,000 survivors in 1892 with the Battle of Wounded Knee, the final battle which was the definitive conquest of the indigenous. And the colonizers here said the same thing. This is empty land waiting to be civilized through the manifest destiny. So we always have that, a land without a people for people without a land. It's a fundamental colonial ideology. So now we have this alliance of Zionism and imperialism leading to the creation of Israel. There's, as I mentioned, a new wave in the late 1900s, a new wave of European colonialist conquest around the world. And Herzl and the other Zionists, they say that a Jewish state has to be built under the wing of powerful European countries, and that this project of Zionism has to serve European interests in this new era of imperialism and colonialism. So the first Zionist Congress, which I mentioned is in 1897, it charges Herzl with finding an imperial backer. Herzl approaches the German Kaiser. Kaiser says no. Then he goes to the Russian Tsar, and he does so at a time when the Russian Tsar was organizing pogroms against Jews, these violent attacks against Jewish villages. The Tsar says no. Then he goes to the Pope. The Pope says no. Then finally, Herzl focuses on the expanding British Empire. And he writes in his diary, and I'm quoting Herzl directly here, England, with her possessions in Asia, should be most interested in Zionism for the shortest route to India by way of Palestine. England's great politicians were the first to recognize the need for colonial expansion. This is why Great Britain's ensign flies on all the oceans. And so I must believe that here in England, the idea of Zionism, which is a colonial idea, should be easily and quickly understood. This is what Herzl says, and then he adds, the anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends. the anti-Semitic countries our allies. Okay? So when we hear, as we are defending Palestinian lives and fighting this genocide, and when we hear, right, that if we critique Zionism, we are being anti-Semitic, remember this reality of Zionism. So how does the British respond? British colonial minister Joseph Chamberlain agrees to offer Zionism a colony anywhere, open quotes, in the English possessions where there were no white people as of yet, close quotes. So European Jewish settler colony now becomes a British and a Western strategy for imperial control of the Middle Eastern region at a time, remember, when the Middle East is now going to be colonized and integrated into world capitalism. So the region has to be opened up. Oil is a central resource now for world capitalism and its dramatic expansion in the post-World War II period. The whole Middle East has to be opened up and integrated into world capitalism. Israel, for this reason, has to be created, so the imperialist and colonial powers would now back Zionism for that purpose. So we have the Nazi Holocaust, partition, and the Nakba. From 1936 to 1945, 6 million Jews perish in the Nazi organized Holocaust. Then from 1946 to 1947, the Zionists fully clamped down now in Palestine. Post-World War II, they've established the Jewish Agency, which is going to coordinate now the Zionist project of conquest, and they formed terrorist groups, literally outright terrorist groups, the Stern Gang, the Irgun, and especially the Haganah. And these terrorist groups, these paramilitary groups, attack British and then they attack Palestinian targets. The 1948 war, which establishes Israel, unleashes Zionist terror. We all have heard this over and over again, that nearly 800,000 Palestinians are expelled. Over 500 villages are destroyed. The Zionists seize 80% of the land, carry out widespread massacres, and Israel establishes itself in 1948 as an exclusively Jewish state. So, again, this is taking place in the larger context of post-World War II world capitalist expansion, the need for world capitalism now to control the resources and bring this region into its fold and under its control. And Israel will be a staging point for world capitalist expansion into the entire region. With the June 1967 war, the occupation of the remaining lands of Palestine takes place. Now, this is why Biden said in 1986 and continues to repeat, I quote Biden here, the U.S. president, "If there were no Israeli state, we would have to invent one." He is saying that because he's saying, look, we so need a platform which will defend Western and world capitalist interests in the region that we have Israel now, but if we didn't have it, we'd have to create it on our own. So Israel now becomes the platform also to contain Arab nationalism and socialism, and also to bolster up the repressive, far-right, conservative ruling Arab elites. Israel is founded through terrorism, ethnic cleansing, massacres, summary executions, concentration camps. We see these black and white reels from World War II, from what the Nazis did, or we see it fictionalized in Hollywood movies, how the Nazis, for instance, when they're going to round up a Jewish family in Berlin or somewhere, they'd burst into the house, they'd grab the Jews, take them off to concentration camps, but before doing so, they would go to the Jewish women and literally take off of them their jewelry, their necklaces, their rings, and then the Nazis would keep them, give them to their own women, etc. There was a recent film, maybe you guys remember the name of the film, it was just a few months ago that it came out. It was about the Auschwitz concentration camp, and the film was about the Hess. Hess was the SS commander, the Nazi commander running this Auschwitz concentration camp. His luxury house is literally right outside of the walls of the concentration camp, and there'd be scenes where he comes out of the concentration camp with all of these clothes and fur coats and expensive items, and he would hand them to his wife, and his wife would look them over, see which dresses fit her, and then if didn't fit her, give them to other people, other German women. So you get those scenes, but those scenes took place in Palestine. They took place in Palestine in 1948. Women are literally told, turn us over those jewels. Their furniture is stolen. Okay, the reason I'm going into all of this is because you get these All of these things taking place in 1948, 3 years after the Nazi Holocaust, these Zionists are doing the exact same thing. And the question is, why? How could it be that Jews who suffered the Holocaust embraced an ideology and a political project that's such a close cousin of Nazism, so conducive to genocide? And here we need to see the power of the Zionist project and its manipulation. This is what Norman Finkelstein, the great Jewish American historian, calls the Holocaust industry, manipulating and weaponizing Jewish grief and suffering and the memory of the Holocaust. What's taking place here is profound form of trauma manipulation, in which Jews are as much a target as are Palestinians. So the strategy here is to make Jews feel, first, they're facing an existential threat. Second, that they can only be protected from that existential threat by blind defense of the Israeli state. Third, you need to whip up a siege mentality. And then fourth, you need to totally dehumanize the Palestinians and critics of Zionism as representing that existential threat. So that's Zionism's Holocaust industry strategy, and it has to be masked by inculcating a psychopathic victimhood complex. Now, I want to say that the latest data shows that, and let me backtrack and say there are two big well, of course, the U.S. state backs unconditionally Israel, sponsors it. Transnational corporate capital backs and sponsors Israel. But within the mass of the population in the United States, there's two big constituencies for Zionism and for defending U.S. policy of supporting Israel. One is the Jewish American community. In that community, 1/3 at this point are anti-Zionist. I've already woken up, was never captured by the Holocaust industry narrative, or have already woken up. So 1/3 now reject the Zionist project. The other 2/3 is a mass base for Zionism, but that is shrinking, and the 1/3 is growing. And it's no surprise, and it's incredibly fantastic to see that this struggle in solidarity with Palestine in defense of Palestinian lives here in the United States is led by Palestinians and also led by Jewish Americans who are saying, not in our name. I mean, we can talk about Jewish Voices for Peace. We can talk about Never Again Now. We can talk about Not in Our Name, all of these different organizations. So that Zionist project is cracking. And that's one reason we see such intense repression right now, directed at Jewish Americans as much as against anybody else. So there's this new generation of anti-Zionist Jews. And that is why Israel is, and the United States, because this is a U.S.-Israeli genocide, we need to be clear about that, it's losing the political war of legitimacy. So now we get to really the last 1/3 of my presentation, and really it's where we've been building up to. This is where my own research, my own specialization as someone that studies and researches and fights against global capitalism, and studies the crisis that it's in. This is where my own expertise comes in discussing what we can call the political economy of Israeli genocide. Ask the question, why genocide? Why now? What's next? And I want to cover 6 points here by way of conclusion. Israel's demographic crisis, that's one. Second is that the Palestinian proletariat is now surplus humanity. The third is the concepts I've developed of militarized accumulation and a global war economy. A fourth of these 6 concluding points is that global capitalism, which is in deep crisis, needs to violently crack open new space for transnational capitalist expansion. 5, I want to say something about this global student and Palestine solidarity intifada, which is continuing and expanding. And then 6, and finally, I want to ask and then attempt to give an initial answer to, what is at stake in Israel, in this Israel-U.S. genocide? What's the larger meaning for humanity? We've seen a continued outmigration of Israeli Jews, and the demographic crisis Israel faces is deepening. And what I'm getting at here is that, remember, Israel is a Jewish state, self-proclaimed Jewish state. And I have to emphasize here, this is Jewish supremacy in that it is a state officially set up exclusively for Jews. The highest laws of the land proclaim that only Jews have a right to self-determination. So in order to legitimate that, Jews have to be a majority. And the Zionist rulers of Israel go crazy every time that they see that Palestinians are a numerical majority. Every time that Palestinians threaten to be that majority, we've seen a new round of ethnic cleansing, intensified repression and occupation. So this precedes October 7 of 2023. Israel is moving into another critical moment of demographic crisis. In recent years, we've seen an out-migration of Jews, not an in-migration. The last large-scale in-migration of Jews was when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1992. 1 million Soviet Jews moved to Israel. Since then, no mass in-migration. Palestinian birth rates are higher than Israeli Jewish birth rates. So this demographic pressures was one of the factors contributing to the current far-right neo-fascist, really fascist government that's taken over in Israel with its desperation to quote-unquote resolve the Palestinian problem. And so well before October of 2023, you see a radical escalation of the settlements, a dramatic settlement expansion in the West Bank. You see an upsurge in settler attacks and IDF attacks and a buildup of these genocidal pressures. So the triggering event may have been Hamas's October 7 attack, but all of this was building up into this burst of outright genocide. The next slide that you're going to see here is refugee camp outside of Bethlehem. Now you're going to see three images here. The first two on the first one on the top left, that's an image of Palestinians being ethnically cleansed out of Palestine, out of their own homeland. Then on the right-hand side, you see their refugee camp when they put up tents. That's in Bethlehem. I was invited to Bethlehem by the University of Bethlehem to give some lectures there. And on the bottom left, I took that photo in what's still the refugee camp. 3 generations later, that's the refugee camp established in 1948. So the point is that according to international law, which is ratified every single year by the United Nations, Palestinians have a right to return from the lands they were kicked off from in 1948 and for just compensation. But the Zionist project will never allow that to happen at all because the Jewish state would collapse if that happened. Right now, there are 7 million Jews in historic Palestine. There's 7 million Palestinians in historic Palestine. And there are 6 million Palestinians or more in the diaspora. So there's just a little bit, about 51% of the population right now is Palestinian. And that's every time again that happens, you see this escalation of repression and ethnic cleansing. You're all familiar with the maps on this next slide, which is showing the never-ending expansion of Israeli colonialism and occupation of Palestinian lands. But here's the thing. When you look at that map, you have to see that this new round of ethnic cleansing culminating now in outright genocide, that was building up. It's constantly been building up and has been accelerating in recent years. So really, I believe that Israel was looking for an excuse to launch genocide, to radically escalate its genocide against the Palestinians. So it's using October 7 as an excuse for what was coming, what was already in the works, boiling over already. So the second of these concluding points is that the Palestinian proletariat has become surplus humanity. We analyze in sociology 2 types of racist structures. The first we call disorganization of the working class and superexploitation of the racialized sector of the working class. So this is a situation where the ruling groups, they divide the exploited classes into 2 different groups. They racialize one portion of those exploited classes, and that they're subject to racial oppression. But the ruling groups need their labor of the victims of this racism. So they're not subject to genocide. So in the United States, you had an historic situation that Black Americans are that super exploited sector of the U.S. working class, first as slaves and later on occupying the lowest rungs of the working class in the United States. That's one model of a racist structure. We saw that, for instance, with the Irish and the British workers historically in the United Kingdom. We see it all over the world. That type of racist structure. The second type we've referred to as exclusion. This is a case where the ruling groups need the resources of that group they're going to racialize and oppress, but they don't need their labor, and so they are subject to genocide. That is what happened with Native Americans in North America. Their land was needed by the ruling groups, But their labor was not needed because that labor came from African slaves and from European immigrants. So that takes us to genocide. So in Israel, we've had this historic tension because the Palestinians are expropriated, right, and they're excluded, they're ethnically cleansed, but the Israeli economy needed their labor, which is why for decades hundreds of thousands of Palestinians would leave the West Bank during the day, work in Israeli agriculture, construction, services, industry, go back to the West Bank afterwards, just like you have massive migrant labor force here in the United States. So that was in tension with the Zionist project of fully getting rid of Palestinians. So you have expropriation, exclusion being in tension with expropriation, super exploitation, right? Of an ethically demarcated, super controlled, super exploited labor force. Now, the Israelis decide, starting in the late 20th century, the late 1980s, 1990s, that they're going to change their strategy. They're going to phase out the use of Palestinian labor, and they're going to start to bring in transnational migrant labor to resolve that tension and to do away with Palestinian labor. Now, that's a long, drawn-out process. It's still going on. But already, starting in the 1990s, accelerating in the last 24 years of this century, you now have thousands and thousands and thousands, tens, now hundreds of thousands of Indian workers, of Filipino workers, of Chinese workers, of Sri Lankan workers, Pakistani workers, Ethiopian transnational migrant workers, Kenyan transnational migrant workers. And of course, these migrant workers have no claim to land. They have no claim to the state. And so it's a much better option for the Zionists, for the Israelis, which is why, by the way, we keep hearing this figure, 1,137 Israelis died in the Hamas attack of October 7. Well, we don't hear in the media actually that Filipinos died, that Thai citizens died, that Nepalese died, because they were there working on these agricultural plantations. So what I'm getting at here is that the mass of Palestinians now become surplus humanity, surplus labor, of no use to world capitalism, of no use to Israeli capitalism. And now they can be subject to genocide. And we're seeing this all around the world, a dramatic expansion of surplus humanity. The estimate that I have in my own research is 2 billion people are of no use to world capitalism, simply surplus. Right? And the borders between regions of intense accumulation and wealth creation in the world capitalist system and those where surplus labor is trying to get in, those borders become death zones. So you have the U.S.-Mexico border, this extremely militarized death zone. You have the Mediterranean, where North Africans, Middle Easterns are trying to get into Europe as this zone of death. You may not know that just a few months before the October 7 Hamas attack, several hundreds of Ethiopians were crossing the border into Saudi Arabia, and the Saudi border guards opened up fire and killed 100 of them right there in cold blood, no consequences whatsoever. They were trying to join 750,000 Ethiopians who are migrant, super exploited, super controlled, immiserated labor in the Saudi kingdom. So this is all over the world. And Palestine is the leading edge in which the Palestinians of Gaza are totally surplus humanity, standing in the way. So the Gaza option is a real-time alarm bell that genocide could become a political tool for resolving the ruling class problem of surplus humanity, which is why we say what happens to Palestine happens to humanity. So warning for all of us. So if you look at these two images, on the left, that's Gaza. You may have been reading about seeing this on your social media posts. You won't get this in the mainstream corporate media, of course. Those are Palestinian men. They are stripped down to their underwear. They're made to lay there, and then they're taken away to dungeons and concentration camps. Many of them won't make it out alive. They'll be subject to sexual abuse and humiliation. The women also, of course, to all kinds of torture and to starvation and to death. But you see that image there. Now you see the other image in front of you, and that is not Palestine. That's not the West Bank. That is El Salvador. And the Salvadoran government opened in March of 2023 the first of this giant supermax prisons to lock up surplus humanity with a capacity to hold 40,000 people. 40,000, and they're being held in the same underwear, squatting down as the Palestinians are. And so shortly after this Supermax prison in El Salvador was opened, the Brazilian government, the Chinese government, the Indian government, and the Turkish government, and other ones, several other governments said, "Wow, that's a great idea," and announced that they would be opening up these giant prisons holding tens of thousands of prisoners. So just caging up and warehousing in these enormous little mini cities surplus humanity to get them out of the way, because world capitalism, global capitalism doesn't have use for them. They could be rebelling. They are rebelling in Palestine, and so they have to be resolved, either genocide or this supermax new global geographies of control. So the third of these 6 concluding points is what I term in my book, and you see a little image there, the Global Police State, a book of mine that came out in 2020, and in that I developed my theory or my analysis of what I term militarized accumulation, an accumulation by repression. So what's going on here is that global capitalism is in deep crisis. It's a multidimensional crisis. It's a political crisis of state legitimacy and capitalist hegemony. It's an ecological crisis of the collapse of the biosphere, so forth and so on. But I want to focus here on the strictly economic dimensions of the crisis of global capitalism, which is what we call technically overaccumulation. The capitalist, transnational capitalist class has accumulated such incredible amounts of wealth, obscene amounts of wealth, and they don't know how to continue to reinvest it, because options for profitably reinvesting all of this wealth they've accumulated are drying up. They're desperately looking, where can we continue to reinvest, continue to accumulate, continue to make profit? And so in response, they've discovered that you build a global police state, that systems of warfare, systems of social control and repression in themselves are enormously profitable and represent new opportunities for accumulation, independent of the political purposes of repression and of warfare. So we're living in this global war economy, in which the ruling groups are investing more and more in warfare and repression, in prisons, etc., in wars against immigrants, against youth, against gangs, etc., etc. So the thing is that Israel is at the very heart of this global war economy, the very nucleus of it, together with the United States. It's at the heart of the global military, industrial, surveillance, homeland security complex. The Israeli economy is a totally militarized economy. Israel exports its systems, its weapon systems, and the training for it all over the world. It's the heart of the Israeli economy. And repression of the Palestinians is big business. These new weapon systems that Israel develops and the surveillance systems are first tested on the Palestinians before they get the good seal of approval and exported all around the world. Pegasus, that spyware, is being used in the U.S., is being used by the Mexican government, by many governments have gotten from Israel this Pegasus, the most sophisticated spyware for your cell phones, to give you an example. So the Israeli political economy thrives on war and on conflict. And that is why, remember earlier in my discussion, I was saying that Israel gives support to all of these military dictatorships and far-right regimes. Well, one, because Zionism is a far-right project. But secondly, because these are their markets. These are the Israeli markets, fascist militaries and dictatorships around the world. So when Russia invaded Ukraine, that was a tragedy for the people of Ukraine, a tragedy for the people of Russia, a tragedy for the people of the world, this giant war. Right? But for transnational corporate capital, it was fantastic. It was a gift, which is why one consultant to all of the weapons contractors, which are now making billions and hundreds of billions of dollars in profit off of that war, why he said at the time that Putin is the very best thing that's ever happened, this invasion. And he said in the actual words, again, he's a consultant for Boeing, for Raytheon, happy days are here again. But this is also why one of the chief financial officers of Morgan Stanley, this global financial conglomerate which heavily invests in Israel, said that the Gaza war, quote, is good for our portfolio. So as the global economy stagnates, genocide becomes enormously profitable and attractive. It resolves political and economic problems for the ruling groups. So the next slide here, I've titled it Social Control, Repression, Warfare. Genocide is enormously profitable and politically useful for global capitalism in crisis. And Israel here is a model of the global police state. By the way, the IDF, trains police forces all over the United States. Uh, Let me pause for a moment and say something. We've been fighting. I mean, I'm in California, but those of us on left progressive social movement forces have been fighting Cop City in Atlanta. And now these similar cop cities are being built all over the United States because the ruling groups fear mass uprisings as global capitalism sinks deeper and deeper and deeper into crisis. 1% of humanity right now controls 52% of the world's wealth. 20% controls 95% of the world's wealth. So 80% of humanity has just 5% of the world's wealth, immiserated, becoming surplus humanity. The ruling groups know that mass uprisings are coming, and they're beefing up the global police state. And so that's why we see these cop cities. But why I'm telling you that is because the first cop city was built in the Negev Desert between the West Bank and Gaza. And it was built as a mini Gaza city by the Zionists, by the Israelis, by the IDF. They looked exactly like a little mini version of Gaza City with the buildings, with the narrow alleyways right there in the desert. And that's where the IDF trained for its genocide against Gaza. And so Cop City in Atlanta was modeled after Little Gaza. That's what it was called, what the Israelis built in the desert. So Israel is this model. You see that image on the left? That's me entering the settler-only area in Hebron, which is a city in occupied West Bank with all that sophisticated technology. And that's outdated. That's 2015, almost 10 years ago. It's even much more sophisticated now. And then you see the graffiti that the settlers have spray painted in the areas that they're settling on. It says, "Gas the Arabs." So before I move on to the final points here of my presentation, we really see in Israel a model for what I call global green zoning. Right? Palestine is the model. And so what you see there is Baghdad. When the U.S. invaded and occupied Iraq in 2003, they set up in the very center of Baghdad, the capital of Iraq, the green zone. And it was steel reinforced, 6-foot long, blast-proof concrete all around the green zone. Inside, of course, you had the U.S. Military commanders, the political colonial authorities. You had the new Iraqi elite that was brought to power by the invasion located in there. You had now the headquarters of transnational corporations are located in the green zone. You had the construction of luxury housing, condominiums, theaters, cinemas, shopping malls, all there in the green zone protected, enjoying the good life, while outside there's this raging war and destruction and death and extermination. So that's we're seeing worldwide, green zoning and gray zoning, where the rich and the powerful and the privileged few are locked up in this green zone, and they're protected by the global police state. And outside the global police state is unleashed on the rest of us. And Israel is the model. Here you see green zones and gray zones. On the left-hand side, you see this horrible war being unleashed against the Iraqis. This is all from Iraq, 2003. And then you see the bottom right of that image here. You see Iraqis being blocked from the green zone by those walls. They could easily look like the apartheid wall in the West Bank. And then you see inside the green zone swimming pools and new condominiums being constructed. So we're moving towards fortress world and global police state. And again, Palestine is the model. And here you see we're seeing the rise of facial recognition and panoptic global surveillance. These new digitalized modalities of mass social control, and they're being reached their maximum in the occupied Palestinian territories. Now, there's a quote here that you want to look at. This is facial recognition image here is, of course, from China, because China is really has the most sophisticated facial recognition systems in the world. But the quote here is Mossad. Mossad is the Israeli CIA. When our students were setting up their encampments, and there's this unbelievable repression unleashed against the students, and that repression came from the highest levels of the Israeli state. I published an article in March when these encampments were just beginning, in which I was discussing the task force that the Israeli state, the Israeli Foreign Ministry, together with the IDF, the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs, and one other Israeli entity, set up a task force to repress the student encampments, to repress us in the academic field, and to do so without showing the face of Israel on it. They were behind it all together with the U.S. state. And then so Mossad sends us a tweet. This is a real tweet from Mossad sent to us on our campuses. Facial recognition can determine whether you participated in pro-Hamas protests at universities. Your jobs and your degrees will be worthless. Your hiring opportunities will be limited. That's the exact quote of a Mossad tweet to us. So fourth, this need of global capitalism to violently crack open new space for accumulation, for expansion. As I was mentioning, these enormous pressures are building up for this expansion, and one of the key areas for global capitalist expansion is the Middle East. And so genocide now becomes a method of primitive accumulation. The limits to expansion must be overcome by these technologies of death and destruction that we see at work in Palestine. One of the things that's happened in the last 30 years, this very dramatic globalization of the entire Middle East. Israeli capital has integrated with Gulf capital, with transnational capital from all over the world. It's all come together, this massive transnational capital involving Israel, the Gulf states, and elsewhere. Investment in energy, tourism, high-tech, construction, infrastructure, finance, luxury, consumption. The sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf states are totally integrated here into the globalized circuits of accumulation together with Israeli capitalists. So it all comes together at the level of the same class interest, the same capitalist economic interest they are all sharing, which is why when we speak of the issue here is Western imperialism against the people of the Middle East, that's missing the point of what's taken place with capitalist globalization. So there's common transnational capitalist class interests in the Middle East, the ruling groups of the Middle East, the capitalist class of the Middle East, that trumps political considerations. Right? It trumps their differences over Palestine. The notion of an Israeli-Arab conflict is an anachronism. It's now something different, more complex. The United States negotiated the Abraham Accords in 2020, in which the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, I believe Kuwait, there was a third country, normalized relations with Israel. You suddenly have hundreds of thousands of Israeli tourists going to those Arab countries. The clincher for all of this normalization was supposed to be Saudi Arabian normalization with Israel. That was supposed to happen in late 2023. It would have happened, but something got in the way. Palestinian resistance, October 7th, got in the way and put that project on hold. The transnational capitalist class was salivating, was saying once that's normalized, the whole region now is open to us in an integrated manner. We're going to be pouring in. We'll have a new outlet for investment and profit making in the face of this stagnation in the global economy that we have been suffering. So really, this is more now than old-fashioned settler colonialism. What's going on in this genocide is the face of a global capitalist system that now can only reproduce itself and expand through bloodshed, through dehumanization, through torture, and through extermination. These are the stakes involved there. So we're seeing around the world an escalation of geopolitical confrontation, but we want to look beyond the surface and see that these are wars over resources, over state competition to get at them, as they're wars of as response to capitalist crisis and capitalist collapse. They're also wars to contain mass revolt from below, wars to make profit. So you see the images on the two images on the left are Ukraine, and the one on the bottom is Gaza. These are wars over resources and over defending global capitalism. So these are transnational wars by global capitalists and states to seize resources. We have the example of the Congo. Here you see in these images the Eastern Congo. 7 million people have been displaced by warfare in recent times, in recent months. Unbelievable mass displacement to get at all of these unbelievable resources in the Eastern Congo because the population simply stands in the way. So you have oil and gas and copper and cobalt and coltron and lead and zinc and gold and diamonds. I mean, the amounts of mineral wealth in the Eastern Congo is unbelievable, and transnational corporate capital needs to get at it by moving the population out from there. And so this is portrayed in the corporate media as ethnic conflict, as local warlords, and sure, that's it on the surface, but behind them is this global capitalist seizure of those resources through violent displacement and extermination. So here you can see in this next image, Netanyahu is on the bottom left here, and he's before the United Nations. This is at the end of September. I believe it was September 30, but just a few days before the Hamas attack and this genocide begins. He's holding up a map of the Middle East, and if you can look closely, you can see that he's not even acknowledging that there's a Palestine, simply just Israel there. But he's holding up this map and he's saying that we have a new Middle East, which we're going to construct now. Of course, that's premised on Saudi-Israeli normalization that I already spoke about. And if you look at that map, the Gazans stand in the way of transnational capitalist expansion throughout the whole region. So what we're seeing, if you look at this map on the next slide, you see that there are this gas and oil reserves in Gaza itself and in Gaza's territorial waters in the Mediterranean. So you can see so clearly here how transnational capital accumulation needs to take place through genocide, which will open the way for a new round of extractive industrial, financial, and commercial investment in Gaza and throughout the Middle East. Something is very, very scary here, and I don't have the full explanation for this. But if you look at the slide that I've just put up now, it's titled Nazarene Corridor and U.S. Pier. So the Israelis, the IDF, announced that it had set up this corridor, and on the top right quadrant there, you see the corridor running all the way from the Mediterranean to the Negev Desert, right through Gaza. On the bottom there, you see the satellite image in which that corridor is so visible. On the left-hand side will be the waters of the shore of the Mediterranean, and was going right to the other side of Gaza. And so the Israeli military, the IDF, has set itself up across that entire corridor. It's used all of its bombs, its 2,000-pound bombs, to literally turn to dust and rubble, and also its bulldozers on either side of that corridor. And so it's dug in there in that corridor, because the plan's there, and then you see that Netanyahu presented this plan for rebuilding Gaza. You see that on the left, this beautiful ultra-modern city with greenery and everything. Of course, that's not for the Gazans, that's not for the Palestinians, but that's this image of how Israel sees it's going to rebuild Gaza as part of this capitalist expansion, and expansion of the Israeli state. So they're calling that the Nazarene Corridor. Now, the only other thing I want to add is that you see there the pier that the United States supposedly built to bring humanitarian aid in. No aid has been brought in through that pier, and there's all of these land ways to bring in humanitarian aid. So why build this pier? Well, I'm not confirming that this is why, but it is certainly, in my view, no coincidence that that pier is exactly on the Mediterranean side of this Nazarene corridor, linking up perfectly with the IDF control of that corridor. So I wanted to bring attention to that. Again, I do not have any evidence to confirm that there's some coordination with that corridor and the point that it meets up, but given genocide that's underway, that's something we want to keep our eye on. So the point is, Palestinians are surplus humanity standing in the way of major global capitalist expansion. And if you look here in the image I have, the Suez Canal is clogged up. It's the world trade is increasing. Not everything can make its way untimely through the Suez Canal. So the Israelis have, and you may remember that a giant container vessel during the COVID pandemic was stuck. It was landlocked. It landed, we call it crashed in the Suez Canal, and that blocked up world trade for several weeks. So the Israelis resurrected their old plan for a Ben Gurion Canal. You can see it in the image there. It goes right through the northern part of Gaza. And once again, the Palestinians just stand in the way of that plan. So the Israeli Ministry of Intelligence released in October 2023, after the genocide started, that map on the bottom left, in which it called for transferring the Gazans into Egypt, but Egypt closed off that border, and transferring the West Bank Palestinians into Jordan. So they're not even trying to hide the intentions of genocide and ethnic cleansing to a new level. We're near the end here, and I want to come back to this global intifada of solidarity with Palestine. The crackdown we're seeing, the repression we're experiencing, is simply unprecedented. Why? Because it's a response to the unprecedented upsurge in Palestine solidarity. The Zionist narrative is cracking. U.S. policy is threatened. U.S. and Israel may control the military battlefield. There's no chance of a Palestinian military victory over Israel. But already, Israel is losing the battle for political legitimacy. And here in the United States, universities have been ground zero for Palestine solidarity, which is why they set up that task force to repress us. But these university administrators are not acting alone. Behind them is the Israeli and the U.S. state, the transnational corporations, which here. And we now have information that the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI were coordinating with these administrators, the repression on our campuses. So the larger story here is that our universities have become brain trusts for the military-industrial complex, for tech capital, for finance capital. So if a pharmaceutical corporation now outsources its research to a university, to a biology and chemistry department at a university, which develops the drug, and then the pharmaceutical corporation grabs it and markets it and makes trillions in profits. So that's the same thing with tech, computer science departments, and so forth. And so what really we have is a university model in which our public universities are no longer public financed. They're driven by tuition, and tuition has skyrocketed. Students are going to be locked into debt and locked into the market, financial market, for the rest of their lives. But the biggest source now is coming from corporate donations and the donations of private donors. The Israeli government has donated $350 million to U.S. universities. So these endowments, university endowments, become major outlets for accumulating and investing capital. And in turn, these endowments are investing in corporations that are profiting off of the genocide, that are heavily invested in Israel and also in the larger Middle Eastern region. So when we call for boycott, divestment, sanctions, we are threatening transnational corporate interests in a very serious way. And we're threatening the U.S. policy towards the whole of the Middle East and North Africa hinges on propping up Zionist Israel. And so our mass protests are a threat to all of these transnational corporate and state interests. So Palestine solidarity has to be criminalized. 300 bills are making their way through states in the United States that will escalate this criminalization by saying that occupying public space, that even blocking sidewalks, is going to be criminalized. It's meant to deter us in the Palestine Solidarity movement, and it's meant to get ready for mass repression of the mass uprisings of all kinds of social movements that they fear. And they're now saying that it's not just criminalizing this, but calling it terrorism. So those that protested against Cop City are being charged with terrorism, an extremely serious felony. That's what they're directing towards us. I'll conclude this slide, and I'm nearing the end of my presentation, by quoting Palantir CEO Alex Karp. Palantir is a multi-billion-dollar high-tech corporation based in Silicon Valley. In January of this year, 2024, they signed an agreement for a strategic partnership with the Israeli Defense Forces to supply high-tech artificial intelligence. And you know that this genocide is being carried out with a high-tech program known as Lavender, in which artificial intelligence is driving these drones and deciding where the bombs are going to be dropped. And that's provided in part by this corporation, Palantir. So its CEO, Alex Karp, was interviewed a couple months ago, and he said, and I'm quoting now, "We think college campus protests are a sideshow. No, they are the show. If we lose the intellectual battle, we will not be able to deploy any army in the West, ever." So the ruling class knows that Palestine solidarity is a fundamental threat to its interests. So let me conclude by asking, what is this global future at stake in Palestine? The battle lines being drawn in the Middle East at this time reflect global battle lines. October 7 is what we call a catalytic event. It sparked something much wider. It's thrown us into a whole new era. Will Israel become a model for how the ruling groups deal with global surplus humanity? A model for global genocide? Remember, we're living in times of unprecedented global inequalities. Our task at this point, to avoid a future of extermination, of Gazification of the entire world, is to link the anti-genocide struggle to working class and popular struggles here in the United States and all around the world. Student worker alliances. Alliances bring in the unions which link different issues together. A global united front in defense of Palestine, and beyond that against fascism and against global capitalism and crisis and its behavior as a wild beast which is becoming cornered. So the ruling groups, I want to reiterate once again, fear mass uprisings, and they are preparing for them. That is why Palestine solidarity is being criminalized. This repression is a dress rehearsal for mass repression. You all know what happened. I'm not going to go into it here, but on our campuses, including at UCLA, the closest to where I live, where fascist brown shirts, these fascist paramilitary forces stormed and beat up the students 5 hours while the police pulled back. Then the next day, the governor said, "How dare the students provoke this violence," and told the cops to go in. So they were beaten violently twice by the capitalist state and by the paramilitary fascist units that work together with the capitalist state. So the outcome of this genocide in Palestine is going to determine what comes next in this global struggle for our very survival. Will fascism win, or will popular mass struggle from below hold it back? Let us remember that World War II did not start with the German invasion in September of 1939 of Poland. It started in the 3-year period of the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. And that civil war was lost by the working class, by the popular classes, by the poor. And it was won by the fascists. That emboldened them to move on the offensive and launch us to World War II. So that's what's at stake here in beating back this genocide. So you see that final image that I have in the next slide. Palestine is a symbol of popular rage and global intifada against a global capitalist status quo in deep crisis and coming for us if we're not successful in fighting back.